That's Nick.
And that's Joseph. And today we're here to talk about episode 7 of Mary and George, which will begin to stream on Stars as of April 5th, 2024. The title of the last episode is War.
Final episode.
You know what I have to say about that?
About war?
Yeah.
What?
Good gall, y'all. What it isn't good for, absolutely nothing.
Ugh, wow.
Say it again.
So was this episode, I think. This was a disappointing end to what I think I'm going to say is a mediocre series, but
I agree.
So this episode starts in the year 1623.
Mm-hmm.
We see that George and Prince Charles have gone to Madrid. So from the last episode, I was under the impression that Prince Charles was going to get the hand of the Infanta, the Spanish king's daughter, but that was not definitive.
Mm-hmm.
So they go out there. Charles thinks to ask for her hand in marriage and like solidify the deal. But really the Spanish were looking for, like it was more political, like they were trying to broker peace. And so it doesn't bode well. And in George's arrogance approaches one of the members of the Spanish,
the negotiator played by Alex, what's his name? Alex Brundamel.
And things devolve very quickly.
Quite a few things. Well, it's only these two fools, the prince and George, who is now the Duke of Buckingham. He's since been elevated from Marquess. We don't know when or how, but that happened. Yeah, it's just the two of them. So what does that look like?
Well, and even the Spanish say like, so the two of y'all just came out here by like no army, nothing.
Mm-hmm.
They look like such a joke.
Mm-hmm.
But George gets into it with that negotiator and basically he does threaten him, saying like, I am the king, I am England, you're going to pay for insulting me, by basically saying like, we don't want this raggedy ass Prince Charles to marry the king's daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So he goes back, but in the interim, while he and Prince Charles were gone, Mary wiggled her way back into the king's good graces, basically saying that in his final hours, because he's now very sick, he needs like a mother figure,
mm-hmm. which he never had.
And Mary knew that because we had been told that by the queen.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, yeah, girl. So he gets rid of everyone, including his doctor, so that Mary can care for him.
Uh-huh.
So when Charles and George return, the king has a new attitude, but because now he's like, he can't drink, he can't go outside. And he's kind of
an invalid.
He's kind of annoyed with George because he's disappointed that their trip to Madrid didn't go well. So George has to come up with a way to get back into the king's good graces. So he decides to do exactly what we were told he shouldn't do and build him a bedroom outside
mm-hmm.
and give him liquor and has sex with him, which basically brings new life into the king. And then the king immediately tells Mary, you can go. I trust George. I love him. I'm going to let him make the decisions.
You've been here too long.
So he lets George go to Parliament and explain the experience in Madrid and basically sort of encourage England to take like a stronger stance with Spain.
He fans the flames of war. He has become a warmonger.
And we can talk about it, but George gives a speech that I did not. I mean, it didn't get me riled up.
Nope.
But after that, everyone's concerned that now England's going to go to war with Spain. And mm-hmm. George is pissed.
You mean James?
I'm sorry, James. King James is pissed. So when George returns back to King James' palace, James tells him, like, I'm so mad at you. I'm stripping you of all your titles, and I'm going to have you executed for treason. So, of course, he panics. Mary is there, and she's like, no, George is not a traitor. He's, he was ill-advised, and we can fix this. And James tells Mary to shut the hell up. And as he's about to, like, I guess, go do what he said he was going to do, he collapses.
Mm-hmm.
They take him back to the house, and George convinces everyone to leave except his mom. And what does George do? Kill the king.
Mm-hmm.
So then we flash forward to 1628, and we see that George is hanging out at some pub, and some guy approaches him, and George obviously assumes that this man's hitting on him. And the guy explains like, no, I know you commanded a troop of soldiers.
I served under you at La Rochelle.
And I served under you. And that was that old, like, you are a terrible leader. 5,000 men died because of you. And George is still like, oh, okay, well, are you sure you don't want to like go up to my room? And the guy kills George.
Stabs him. Yep.
Stabs him to death in the middle of this pub. And the final scene is Mary is at home at her dining room table
with her dark brood spread
with her
before her.
dysfunctional ass family. And then the series just ends.
Yep. No talk, no after credits verbiage about any of these people. But for those who would like to know, when King James did die in 1625, Charles, his son, took the throne. And yes, there was a war that I think lasted for like 5 years with Spain.
The series doesn't explain whether or not the war happened.
No, when we flash forward to the king dying in 1628, when George really was assassinated. I looked that up, but I mean, not in this particular fashion for sure. But looking up, so I didn't want to look up Mary or George ahead of time because I was ignorant of them as historical figures. But there's a lot the series does not touch upon, such as the fact that King James allowed George to be the head of Parliament, and Parliament tried to impeach him twice, and King James had to dissolve Parliament both times to save him from that ruin.
So he was really sprung on George.
Yes, who apparently was his last and greatest lover.
Okay, there's a lot to talk about, I guess, but did you get the sense that King James loved George like that?
I didn't. And in fact, he says something in the speech, I think in the episode 6, when George is asking if the king loved Queen Anne, he said no, because love is this fickle thing that changes. And George says, what about my love for you? And he says something about like he doesn't believe it just because of the nature of love.
I did not get the sense from watching the 7 episodes that King James like really loved George like that.
Well,
or if we don't call it love, like I don't even think he was that infatuated with him.
Well, in the anguish that he's expressing before his murder, when the outside bed set is on fire, he says, what have I done? I fell in love with this empty boy.
Right.
Like it was lust of the flesh. It wasn't love.
Well, let me go through my little notes first, and then we can discuss everything as a whole. Prince Charles is so unappealing, and him in Madrid, when it's time for Prince Charles to address the Spaniards, this old awkward looking boy gets up and sings a song, and that was so uncomfortable.
It was uncomfortable.
But I thought the Infanta looked amazing.
Samuel Blenkin plays Prince Charles.
Are all Prince Charles so unappealing? Because
well, there was a lot of inbreeding with these royals.
It's like a little rodent. Okay. What did the series just didn't do so many things for me, but one of the things I was really expecting was what did the people of England think of their king's queering? Like what it's like no one really talks about.
What was the public opinion? What was his what do they call it? The acceptability when I see these news stories about whoever the current president is, what is his rating with the public? What's that called?
Likability.
His likability.
Well, because we hear people make snide comments, basically like, referring to his boys, but they're more just like matter of fact. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, that's the king. And even like Mary's husband, he says something like just saying that like they're all like sinner, not even sinners. He just says like this is like Sodom or but it's all very like light. But this series focuses so much on the king being like having sex with men and George having sex with everybody that I was expecting there to be some sort of commentary on what people actually, even if it was just to the extent of like they tolerate it because this is the king.
Or if that it was kind of one of those open cultural periods,
Right.
that because it was so open, there was a huge backlash.
Because I'm
say
sure,
say Oscar Wilde and his affair, which caused the coinage of the term homosexuality, right?
well, I'm sure we can get on YouTube right now and find some sort of historian talking about King James sexuality and the
Sir
public
Francis
perception
Bacon and all of them.
Yeah, so it's like the series doesn't really address that at all. Getting back to George, we get, because there was a little lull in like the sexuality the last, like the episodes 5 and 6.
Mm-hmm.
But then in this episode, we get like this sort of scene where we see George having sex with members of the Spanish team who they meet, men and women. And then towards the end, before King James dies, we get a moment where
he's doing the same.
So I didn't understand. Like, it just feels so gratuitous. It also feels gratuitous that we see right after King James is, after George kills him, then we see that George had another baby with Catherine.
Yeah.
Why do we need
boy
that?
To show, I guess, that he was busy doing things.
So Sir Francis Bacon is living in exile somewhere, and his nose has fallen off. He's wearing like a mask over his nose. And all of a sudden we see that Mary has gotten into his house and is holding him with a knife to his throat. And they basically have a confrontation, which I didn't understand the point of that, because she doesn't kill him. She says there are things worse than death. And then he goes, oh, like betrayal. So I feel like that scene only served the purpose of Sir Francis Bacon explaining to her that her son was
knew about Sandie's impending death. Yeah.
Mary's girlfriend. Yeah. So I thought that was weak. The scene where George confronts the negotiator, and then we get them meeting with the Spanish again, but they want the prince to convert to Catholicism, and
they're like, absolument pas.
I just think that was also weak. Like, because the way it looks, if you know nothing about world history, is that this doofy looking boy rode a horse to Spain.
Well, because it doesn't take into the vitriol about these leaders in England and the Protestants versus the Catholics is, I mean, my God, the number of people that were executed between, so King Henry VIII created the Church of England so he could get divorced, and then he had his first daughter Mary, who they would end up calling Bloody Mary, was Catholic because her mother was Spanish Catholic, and then in Anne Boleyn he had Elizabeth, who was Protestant, and between even just those two women, because his son I think was the feeble one that he had with Jane Seymour that died. Just those two women switching power caused so much death. So yes, to watch this scene where this, stupid little young man is saying like, I would never become Catholic, it really has no impact unless you have some kind of context about, that really would have had a significant ripple effect.
Right. Because he does say like, oh, the people won't like that, but it's like, it's more than that. Like,
it is a lot more than that. Yeah.
What do we think of the main characters overall? We can start with the king. So who plays the king?
Tony Curran.
I liked him. I mean, I think he, if I had to imagine like what a gay Scottish king would be like.
That's a bit unruly. And
he definitely fit the role. And I think he's like handsome enough.
He is. I think he's probably too good looking for what.
Yeah, probably.
That ended up happening health-wise to this person. But
well, especially towards the end. But I think he did a good job. What about Julianne Moore?
Oh, well, she's my favorite part.
She's also my favorite part, and I think she was the most fun.
Yes,
up till like episode 4, but then once we get into 5, it seems like
she takes kind of she becomes kind of put in the back burner.
Yeah, and then
it becomes rote.
Yes, exactly. And then who played George?
Nicholas Galitzine.
I mean, I thought he was okay. It might be a function of the script too, but like if I'm referencing his big speech at Parliament in episode 7, I did not think he was compelling.
I think it's part of the script and part of the casting is I do not believe that he would ascend to this cocky, aggressive power player in this realm.
Well, he's not written like he's, I don't know. I keep referencing House of Cards, but I feel like he doesn't seem as cunning
Well, it's
as
like
he should be if I think about.
there's never that moment where he has the realization of like, I need to start behaving this way
Right.
to get what I want.
Well, because for most of the series, it's his mother sort of influencing him and fixing his messes. And then when she's not available to him, he makes even bigger messes. So really, he never demonstrates that he's capable.
Right.
So then it just feels like, so then what is he? Is he very good looking? Yeah, he is. I mean, especially if you think, well, it's like, who knows what the real George looked like, but I think he fit the role of like an attractive young man.
An attractive young toy. But then I don't ever, what I'm not led to believe is that he would have any kind of influence on anyone around him besides those who were trying to have sex with him.
I'm just so disappointed that we didn't. So it is lacking substance. We don't. The history is sort of glossed over to just make these big leaps, broad strokes, and then the characterizations. Like I don't. Everything just happens so easily that it just. After a while, I think it was a slow descend into a pretty disappointing finale.
It's a slow descent. I mean, you get the basics, like England and Spain have like this contention, but why? It goes so much deeper than you could ever imagine from this series, because it, and with Walter Raleigh in there and whatever episode that was, the Spanish Armada being defeated, which was partially due to the weather being on England's side. Also, Mary Queen of Scots, the cousin that Elizabeth beheaded, who's the mother of James, was also involved in all of that. And James did not want to have war with Spain. Like, they're just all kinds of juicier tidbits that I think that it's just kind of glossing over, that I think you could get a better sense of, even with just the dialogue being a bit more polished about what people are talking about, instead of spending time with all of these kind of frivolous exchanges. Like the whole thing with Sandie and the lesbian relationship with Mary, it's like, I don't know how well configured that is anyway.
I don't know why we needed that, because we really get I mean, Julianne Moore's character has almost no depth. So then it's like, what was the purpose of showing her having this little girlfriend when they don't? I mean, none of these people seem like human beings. So it felt gratuitous. Okay. So I'm disappointed, because if you think the show's called Mary and George, you watch the trailers, all the marketing material, you would assume that it's this very like salacious story about this mother-son duo,
toxic mother-son duo,
who basically rose to the top of, English Parliament at the time. But the series as a whole, like if I had to describe it, is like, there's this mom who kind of faked her way into being a woman of nobility,
of substance,
and then sort of wiggled her way into the king's court by using her son as bait. But that sort of ends at like episode 3. And then after that, it's sort of this awkward sort of slide into the king's death and George's death. But then I was expecting it to be a lot more lavish, and I was expecting us to see how Mary, like the fruits of her labor. But we don't. The series feels very, I wouldn't say it feels cheap, but it just feels very small. Like we never get a sense of how decadent things were. Even I think I mentioned in episode 6, her girlfriend Sandie says like you have all this money and we live in this amazing house. And it's like, we really don't see.
Well, decadent, and then the cultural ripple effects that went on for generations and, still have scarred, I think, certain cultural elements through today from these people. Not Mary and George Villiers per se, but the whole milieu of all of these people, the ones directly before them and after them, like they set precedents and created difficulties and problems that the reverberations of, I would argue, are still felt.
As a sort of tawdry, melodramatic tale, I think this is pretty mid. As a history lesson, it fails.
Oh, for sure. I mean, but you can't expect anything.
As a character study, it fails. I mean, we really don't. George doesn't seem like a person, which one could argue like he was being used as a tool. But it's like, I never felt anything
for him. Well,
for any, the only person I kind of felt bad for was that damn, like the maid who got her eye poked out by John. I felt bad for her.
And we keep flashing to her too. But what I don't get a sense of is, what did it feel like to be, I mean, nobody alive now would know this, but could we reconstruct what it felt like to have been gay then, and what that really meant, and what the difference between what you were allowed to do in court when this behavior was allowed by the top level versus, outside in the real world among the working man. And because that's like, there are similarities, there are parallels with acceptability amongst cultures and in these realms, urban versus rural, etc. today. And there would have been those distinctions, I feel.
That's a good point, because not only do we not get what people thought of these shenanigans, but we also don't get from the actual, like, at the bare minimum, George, how he, because, in episode 2, I think
in episode 1
where he says bodies are about, like, when he starts to learn about, and then that's kind of it. And then we only see a lot of gay male sex until this episode, where we see him having sex with multiple women in like a really quick montage that occurs twice. So and then of course he married that Catherine lady the last episode and had 2 kids with her, I suppose. But yeah, we like,
well, that the maid in the beginning is like, that he thinks he's in love with, is, I see you looking at men, and it's, I don't even, I'm curious, I would a woman of that class and of course maybe have enough street smarts to recognize those kind of signs in her lover, would she just blurt it out like that, and would the repercussion be like, oh, maybe you're right?
Well, or even Prince Charles, like, his dad is a
flaming homosexual who's
a budgery, or what do they call it, a budgery, or they use some word to describe.
Yeah, I keep saying bun bearing, but that's from Oscar Wilde's Importance of Being Earnest. But
like, your dad has all these men everywhere who he's openly having sex with
and neglecting you and your mother.
Neglecting you and your sick mother. And all we get is him being mad that he's neglected. But it's like, what do you think of? And then the only thing he ever says is that he tells George, like, when I'm king, people like you will be where they belong. But yeah, there's just, I think for something that's being marketed as so queer, I'm really disappointed that there's no examination of what life must have been like. Specifically for George. I mean, he's basically, because there's a moment when he confronts Sandie, the ex-brothel madam, basically asking, like, how much does my mom pay you? And she's like, boy, you and me are the same. You think everything you have isn't because you've rented out your body? And then he just looks at her like, yeah, right. But it's like, no, that is true. And we don't ever once get a sense of how you feel about any of it. We don't see you, and we never see George enjoying his spoils. Right.
Or Mary, really.
Or Mary. She doesn't even look different.
No.
The only time she looks odd is the time that she was meant to look bad to go see the king's court, where she's wearing that garish makeup. But outside of that, she always looks put together. Granted, she's supposed to be a woman of some means. But yeah, I was thinking, like, at least after she got John to marry Frances and now has this big dowry, I was hoping we were going to see, like, her wearing jewels and getting a fancy horse and carriage. Opulence. There is zero opulence.
Yeah.
There's no change in how she's living. In fact, for half the series, when she gets her little girlfriend, she spends all her time in London staying with her girlfriend in her raggedy apartment. And yeah, George doesn't He doesn't seem to care that he's like the king's main squeeze. Like nothing about him. He's not necessarily arrogant. The king's quarters don't look that like palatial. I don't know. But I think we've made our point as to how we felt about the series. I think for Rotten Tomatoes, we should give our pull quotes. Mm-hmm. What is yours?
More so a suggestive soap opera than royally scandalous historical fiction, Mary and George falls short of the debaucherous perversity its marketing suggests and instead requires a standard awareness of the figures and period it resuscitates to really comprehend their debasement.
Mine, what it lacks in substance, it makes up for salaciousness, mostly. I think I'll say it's fresh because I do think Julianne Moore, Nicola Walker. I think
Trina Dearholm.
And then just sort of the gay. I mean, especially like in the first half, it is pretty. There's some fun to be had,
sure,
in like how audacious it is, but yeah, this second half was like, not the best.
It fizzles out.
It does. What would you give the series overall?
2.5.
I would give it 2.5 out of 5. I thought it was okay. Anything else?
No.
Join us on Patreon and listen to our podcast. Bye.